In 10 years, there were 459 victims. That's more than most 20th century serial killers. His name was Yegor Bashkatov. They tried to catch him, but his crimes were lost in the chaos of the country. This isn't just the story of a maniac. It's the story of a time when people disappearing became the norm. And if you think there's a limit to human cruelty, this story breaks right through it.
Listening to podcasts about maniacs, murderers, and true crime stories, each of you pursues your personal goals. Some seek an escape from the routine of everyday life, while others aim to thrill themselves, invoking fear and awe in a safe environment. This passion is like a forbidden fruit. It beckons and enchants, provoking irresistible desires to plunge into the abysses of human depravity and darkness, where humanity ends and the monster begins. Listeners of these dark narratives find something captivating in them that makes their hearts beat faster and their minds sink into a fog of anxious thoughts. They seem to become witnesses to someone else's nightmares, penetrating the darkest corners of human nature. And this immersion, strangely enough, brings them a peculiar satisfaction, quenching their thirst for thrills and mysteries. However, all the servants are united by curiosity. Where is the bottom of this dark abyss of human cruelty? Where does the realm of cold indifference and the burning pleasure of others' suffering end? Where is this bottom? Where there are no screams or cries, only dead silence, interrupted by the hoarse breathing of souls, torn beyond recognition. And in this silence, like in a thick fog, something terrifying and insurmountable shines through, indifference to life, to light, to existence itself. In the grim annals of criminal history, there exists the name of a man who broke this bottom, becoming a record holder for the number of murders, taking the lives of 459 people and leaving behind a trail of blood and pain so long and terrifying that it is impossible to forget. Yegor Bashkatov reached this level independently, becoming something that barely resembles a being created for love and compassion. Each of his murders was coldly and calculatedly planned. Like an artist creating his dark works, unlike his colleagues, he had no preferences in victims. His victims were men and women, young and old, innocent souls who fell into the clutches of a monster devoid of mercy and compassion. He did not just kill, he destroyed worlds, turning the lives of his victims into a nightmare from which there was no escape. However, in normal peaceful times, the emergence and development of such a monster would have been impossible. Therefore, he became an echo not only of a cruel and bloody period in history, when even the activities of a beast like Bashkatov were lost among the overall total horror. "It's a pity there is no gun," thought the peasant, riding through the forest on wax. In the evening, a group of 3 peasant coachmen drove into the yard of one of the carriers, where they decided to spend the night so they could continue their journey in the morning. One of the peasants, gripped by anxiety, did his best not to show it to his companions. However, the closer night approached, the more their expressions changed. Whereas before they had interacted with the man in a friendly and welcoming manner, trying to win him over, cracking jokes, telling tall tales, and cursing all along the way, now, as if taking off their masks, they began to eye the goods being transported. They looked at him himself with pity, as if he were doomed. The man decided not to fall asleep and simply lay there with his eyes closed, expecting something bad to happen. When his companions left the house, he quietly followed them and overheard their conversation. From it became clear that the group was waiting for someone named Yegor with a potion. They discussed the unfortunate fate of their fellow traveler and argued over who would get which of his belongings. One of them warned fearfully, "Let him do his job and don't go near the house until morning, or you'll be next. When he's finished, we'll take the body and bring it to the railroad, and then we'll see who gets what." After Yegor was mentioned, the group's mood noticeably worsened. The man, not fully understanding what was happening, instinctively felt that this trip would end badly for him. Quietly and unnoticed, he grabbed some of his clothes and left the house. Driven by fear, he headed to the Armavir police station. Despite his dislike and the persecution he faced from the authorities, it was almost by chance that the beginning of the end was set in motion for the beast whose very existence embodied the darkest of fears, a symbol of human cruelty in its most extreme form. Our story begins in the village of Semidesyatnoye in the Voronezh region, where in 1879, in a peasant family typical of that era, Yegor Ivanovich Bashkatov was born. It is important to understand that up until the 1950s, many documents that could have served as valuable sources of biographical information simply did not exist or were extremely limited. Civil registration, as we know it today, was rare, and was a privilege reserved for the well-to-do citizens. Records of birth, marriage, and death were often kept only in church books, access to which could be restricted or completely lost as a result of wars, fires, and other disasters, which were not uncommon in these areas. Record keeping at that time was a manual process, prone to errors and damage. Paper documents were easily destroyed by water, fire, or simply by the passage of time. Archives could be poorly stored and damaged during use. Unlike in the digital age, recovering lost data was virtually impossible. Therefore, despite the complexity and unusual nature of Yegor Bashkatov's biography, there is not that much information about him. Often, the available information is contradictory. However, according to Yegor himself, his mother fell ill and passed away when he was very young. After that, the boy was raised by his father, who was an alcoholic. The lack of stability and certainty about the future became a part of the little boy's everyday life. His father's alcoholism affected every aspect of family life. He often couldn't keep a job, and the family suffered from poverty. Yegor had to grow up very quickly in order to survive. A lack of food, warm clothing, and basic comforts became the norm for him. School could have been a salvation for Yegor, a place where he could develop and grow. However, because of poverty and the need to help with household chores, he often missed classes, and a little later stopped attending school altogether. Without an education, his future became uncertain and hopeless. He found himself trapped in a vicious cycle of poverty and ignorance, from which it was hard to escape. On top of all these problems, there was another important aspect, the social one. In a small village, rumors spread quickly. The family, whose reputation had been tarnished by the father's alcoholism and the mother's death, became the object of scorn and ridicule. Yegor felt like an outcast, someone his peers avoided interacting with. Social isolation, combined with beatings from his father and poverty, created in him a deeply wounded and resentful person, distorting his perception of the world and its ideals. However, one day, the already difficult situation became even worse. Yegor's father, having gotten quite drunk, decided to go for a swim, but weakened by alcohol, he dove in and drowned. No one ever saw the boy's father again. Having become a complete orphan, his antisocial behavior only worsened. At a young age, he became addicted to alcohol and card games. The young man increasingly obtained money and food through theft and robbery. Despite this way of life, he managed to avoid punishment. By the age of 17, Yegor had gained a less than stellar reputation among his fellow villagers and residents of neighboring villages. It was at this age that he decided it was time for him to find a life partner. But because of his bad reputation in the village, he had almost no chance of getting a decent wife, which was also part of the social pressure of that time. Therefore, he had to choose from those whom no one else wanted. His first wife was a girl who suffered from epilepsy, whom other suitors avoided. Some people didn't want to get involved with a sickly girl, while others, influenced by superstition, thought she was possessed by the devil. However, even this attempt by Igor to become part of society was unsuccessful. One day, coming home after a drinking binge, he found his wife already cold. During an epileptic seizure, the girl fell and struck her head on a corner. After this incident, there is almost no reliable information about Igor's life up until he was 35. It can only be assumed that his antisocial behavior and pathologies continued to worsen. The future murderer himself never spoke about this period of his life. In 1914, the wind of history, like a master sculptor carving new figures from old foundations, touched the thoroughly degraded 35-year-old Yegor. He was drafted into the army and sent to the front of the First World War. However, from the very first days, Yegor felt little desire to fight for the Tsar and obey the officer's orders. So, when a convenient opportunity arose, he allegedly killed an officer, taking his uniform, military decorations and weapons, and deserted from the ranks of the armed forces of the Russian Empire, quietly making his way back to his homeland. Returning to his native village in this uniform, he greatly surprised his fellow villagers. Many were astonished that the unremarkable Yegorka had suddenly become not only a hero, but also an officer. Taking advantage of his new status, he resumed his pre-war lifestyle: card games, moonshine, theft. However, this did not last long. Already in that same year, 1914, his plan failed. Bashkatov was caught and put behind bars, accused of desertion. Strangely, his indictment did not include a charge of killing an officer. After all, in that case, he would have faced the death penalty, but instead he got off with a relatively light punishment: imprisonment. It is possible that the story about the officer emerged in 1917, when the winds of history once again shifted in Yegor's favor. That was when he was released from custody by the Bolsheviks, who had seized power. The wild and mostly illiterate horde of the workers' and peasants' army was struck by Yegor's story. They sensed in him a kindred spirit, a soul just as degraded as their own, a comrade in the struggle for slogans they couldn't even repeat. Perhaps it was at this point that the story was embellished with the murder of an officer to showcase Yegor's fight against the Tsarist regime. After the October Revolution of 1917, the Russian Empire found itself in a state of civil war, chaos, and devastation. And within the depths of Bolshevik ideology, the idea of creating food requisition detachments was born. Since the Reds, due to their marginal origins, were incapable of carrying out reforms or large-scale changes, they acted in their own way. They created armed groups to forcibly seize grain from the peasants. The official goal of the food requisition detachments was the fair distribution of resources, but in practice they often used criminal methods. Armed marginals, hiding behind the slogan "Rob the robbers," would break into peasant homes, taking not only the surplus but also the last reserves of food, leaving families with no means to survive. Resistance was suppressed with extreme brutality. Those who tried to defend their property were branded as enemies of the socialist revolution, and were often subjected to arrests, beatings, or even thousands of peasant families were pushed to the brink of survival, and in some regions, famine began. The Soviet authorities actively used methods of terror and repression to suppress opponents and strengthen their regime. Many of those who joined the new regime saw it as an opportunity to unleash their darkest and most brutal tendencies. And of course, one of them was Yegor. A nobody and an outcast who had gained power, he did not miss the chance to fully display his talents. During the destruction of the old world and the building of the new one, he became a member of one of those gangs of robbers under the red banner. Yegor robbed and intoxicated by this, he quickly gained a grim reputation even among his fellow outcasts, as the sadism and cruelty he displayed were savage even by the standards of his communist masters. Even in those grim times, the Reds, who had set this bloody machine in motion, would pull Yegor back for his sadistic tendencies and excessive mutilation of peasants, as he derived an unhealthy pleasure from the process. Yegor Bashkatov could no longer stop and was looking for a way to increase his dose of euphoria. He began to feel constrained among the Reds and, using already established models, decided to create his own food requisition detachment. Yegor started small, with thefts. Having been caught at it a couple of times, he managed to avoid punishment, since to the communists he was considered one of their own. Each time he was let go, even though for others such an offense during wartime could have meant the penalty. Realizing that this couldn't go on forever, and that next time he might simply be given a one-way ticket to Siberia or a bullet to the head, he changed his tactics. The old law enforcement system had already been destroyed, and the new law enforcers, who often couldn't even read, were unable to cope with the unprecedented surge in banditry. Destroyed cities, burned villages, and millions of refugees, all of this created fertile ground for criminals. Refugees became easy prey for robbery and assault. Even when entire families disappeared, no one looked for them. And this gave criminals like Bashkatov complete freedom of action. Thanks to the chaos that reigned everywhere and his own cunning, he managed to remain elusive for almost 10 years, right under the noses of the detectives, traveling by train from Ossetia to the Moscow region. Due to the heavy passenger traffic and the lack of any rental housing nearby, passengers had to spend the night at transfer stations while waiting for available seats on passing trains. It was at these very stations that Igor operated. He would strike up conversations with passengers and, after chatting with them, offer them lodging and a good meal for a modest fee, pretending to be a small-time landlord. But the way to his house always led through a dark forest. Since the victims were unfamiliar with the area and the offer almost always came in the evening, finding themselves in the dark in the forest, the future victims would agree to spend the night in the hut. And when the victims fell asleep, he would hit them on the head with a homemade club, which he called the mixture. The club was a stone placed inside a sack and tied with a rope. From such a the victims made no sound and immediately the victims' belongings were taken, including those they wore, and the bodies were buried in the forest. After committing several such robberies in one place, before any commotion arose and people started searching for the missing, Bashkatov would immediately move on to the next station, where he operated in exactly the same way, following the same scheme. At that time of widespread impoverishment, it can be said with a high degree of certainty that his victims did not possess any valuables. That's why Bashkatov relied not on quality, but on quantity. One after another while drinking, he almost every day. At some point, coming out of his drunken stupor and frenzy, he realized that this couldn't go on for much longer. Sooner or later, he would be caught, and he would never be able to get rich this way. So gathering up his loot, Yegor Bashkatov moved to Armavir, where he bought himself a small house, a horse, and a cart. He married Natalia Shtukina, a woman with a less than spotless reputation. However, all of this was just a cover and a change of hunting grounds. In Armavir, Yegor decided to form a gang and recruited 2 vagrant drunks who were interested only in alcohol and money. He picked himself some rather decent actors who began traveling from station to station, posing as employers or employers' assistants, inviting people to work with promises of good pay. Naturally, they didn't offer work to everyone, but only to those who had a lot of luggage. If they came across someone who didn't need a job, they would offer lodging, try to sell valuable items at a low price, and so on. Once someone agreed and left the station with them, that person was never seen again. There was yet another way for these to make money. After striking up a conversation with their future victim, the gang would find out whether the person had any relatives and if there were any valuables or money at home. If the victim answered yes, the bandits would either force them to write a letter to their family asking them to sell everything they could and come to the address given in the letter, or they would forge the letter themselves. In any case, the victim's fate was a relatives who responded to the letter would arrive, meet with the gang, and be taken to the forest, where a small hut was located. There, Yegor would be waiting for them with his potion. Notably, only Bashkatov carried out the killings. His partners in the bloody business were well aware of his hobby and would leave the hut in advance so as not to share the fate of the maniac's victims. After the he would be seized by a madness that even his accomplices feared. However, there was a flaw in this mass-produced craft. There were too many and hiding them became difficult. This circumstance pushed him to recruit new members for the gang. Bashkatov would reject candidates if they couldn't stop drinking alcohol in time and get to work. He selected capable workers, and those who were incapable, exhausted, or who simply found out about the craft, he buried in the forest. In this way, he eliminated unreliable accomplices, and the gang became disciplined, since everyone understood what disobedience could lead to. After a short time, the gang numbered more than 10 members. Everyone had their own responsibilities. Some tracked the victim, some made contact, some sold off the stolen goods, and some washed the blood out of the clothes. Bashkatov even involved children and his common-law wife in his activities. In the 1930s, an unprecedented famine swept across the expanses of Uzbek Soviet Union. Fields that once fed 1,000 families now lay barren, and villages where the cheerful chatter of children was always heard were plunged into eerie silence. The roots of this disaster go back to the policy of forced collectivization initiated by Joseph Stalin at the end of the 1920s. Aiming to create large collective and state farms, the authorities forcibly consolidated peasant households. Peasants who had cultivated their small plots for centuries were forced to surrender their land, livestock, and equipment for communal use. Those who resisted were labeled kulaks, declared enemies of the people, and exiled to Siberia or Kazakhstan. These terrible years became an even more ideal environment for Bashkatov, since none of the authorities cared about the murders. At that time, in many cities of the Volga region, the bodies of people who had died of hunger lay by the thousands right on the streets. But what the investigators found next sent a chill down their spines. It was the diary of Yegor Bashkatov, in which he meticulously recorded the crimes he had committed. It listed the dates, locations of the murders, and the names and surnames of the victims. The first entry in the diary was dated 1922 and the last one January 5, 1932. In total, the book contained records of 447 victims. However, during the further investigation, testimony from other accomplices established the number at 459 victims. During one of the interrogations, Bashkatov stated that all the people who were robbed and sent to the next world were anti-communists, anti-Soviet, and generally supporters of the White Army. Without even realizing it, he tries to cloak his terrible crimes in a mantle of righteousness. Like many other maniacs, he claimed that his actions were nothing more than missions to cleanse the planet. The first of his gang members began cooperating with the investigation and confessed to everything. In his confession, he stated that he kept the diary so that he could take it to the police and report that there were still many elements in the country acting against Soviet power. and so supposedly he was waging a merciless war against them. With this diary, he wanted to prove how much painstaking work he had done in identifying these illegal and negative elements. At the same time, he stated that yes, of course, there were certainly excesses in his work, but they were not committed intentionally, rather out of anger towards the saboteurs. Even the executioners from the NKVD were shocked by the pleasure with which the maniac described the murders. The investigator noted this in the case file. A person of peasant origin, a declassed and degenerate element during the period of socialist construction, striving for a parasitic and dissolute way of life. The entire gang was found guilty of theft, robbery, assault, and murder. The court, once a sanctuary of truth and law in Soviet times, became a theater where people's fates were decided not by the rule of law, but by the will of powerful shadows hiding behind the scenes of authority. That is exactly what happened in this case. The court established the gang's involvement in the murder of 100 people. And then it didn't even bother to simply check Bashkatov's diary. By Stalin's order, all participants were sentenced to execution by firing squad. The children of Bashkatov and other gang members were sent to orphanages. Their fate remains unknown.